If you're thinking about switching to a 7 or 8 string guitar and you have only experienced a 6 string guitar, there are some growing pains in that transition. Each one will take some effort to overcome, but being aware of them can help focus your practice. These are 6 things that I experienced while switching from a 6 string to an 8 string guitar, and some tips on how to overcome them. A lot of these topics deserve their own video to explore them more in depth, but like they say, knowing is half the battle. If you've ever spent any amount of time learning the note names on your 6 string guitar, switching to an 8 string can be a bit of a smack in the face. I expected that I could simply pick up the 8 string guitar, learn the new notes on strings 7 and 8, and be back to where I was within a couple of months. What I failed to realize though is that learning the notes on the fretboard is not simply an exercise in rote memory. It is the result of years of learning and practicing scales and chords and songs and creating relationships across the fretboard between notes. For example, on the 6 string guitar, a lot of people spend some time learning the names of the notes on string 6. This helps to develop a relationship to the bass note of the chords that they're playing. So if you're doing bar chords, you always know what chord you're doing just because you know that bottom note. I think learning this way makes a lot of sense, since the bass note often determines what chord we're doing in Western music. And from the perspective of a guitarist, when we look at our guitar neck, we are seeing string 6 first. It's the closest to our eyes. So we see string 6 and then all the other strings happen in relation to that. So now back to our 8 string guitar. Not only are there 2 more strings worth of notes to learn, but our whole frame of reference changes by changing our bass string. The whole perspective of the notes are shifted. So it kind of puts the whole fretboard into a new context when our bass notes are shifted. If you are doing drop E, your bass note will be the same as before, however, string 7 is different. Now you have a perfect 5th tuning on the bottom, and you will still have to go through this process of learning a new tuning system. At this point, I don't really have any advice on how to overcome this in terms of exercises you can do while you're practicing. All you can really do is keep practicing and keep playing songs and scales and chords that include our 2 new strings. If you avoid those 2 strings while you're playing, your mental map will never develop to include them, and that perspective shift will never actually get to happen. You'll be left being one of those guitar players who plays an 8 string guitar, but really they just play a 6 string guitar, ignoring the other 2 except for when they want to play some gent or add an extra bass note once in a while to one of their chords. And I hope, like me, you don't want to fall into a rut like that. You may have noticed that even if you use a tuner to tune your guitar, and you get every string perfectly in tune, it still sounds terrible, especially on that 7th and 8th string. Something piano tuners have to deal with is that lower strings actually take more energy to get to vibrate, and because of their thickness, their harmonic frequencies aren't always perfectly in tune. To compensate, piano tuners will often tune the lowest notes on a piano down a few cents. Yes, it makes the instrument technically not perfectly in tune, but as an instrument, it is in tune with itself and sounds much better. We can accomplish the same thing on our 8th string by tuning the 7th string down about 5 or 6 cents, and our 8th string down about 10 or 11 cents. If you have thicker strings than I do, you may have to actually tune down even further than that to compensate. I'm going to tune the lowest 3 strings, so the E string, the B string, and the F sharp string, to as close as I can get it into the middle. Okay, so there we go. Listen what happens now when I try to play some octaves or fifths using those strings. So you should be able to hear that the lowest string is a bit sharp. It's out of tune, even though they are pretty much perfectly in tune with what the tuner says. So in order to counteract this, we have to tune those lowest 3 strings a little bit lower. So on the 6th string, I'm going to go down about 2 cents. There we go. I just kind of want it to hover on the edge of the green there. On the 7th string, the B, I'm going to go down about 5 to 6 cents. And on the 8th string, I'm going to go down about 10 cents, 10 or 11. There we go. That should be good. So now if we listen to it, we can hear much better than before. A problem that guitar players have is called sympathetic resonance. This is when we play a note on our guitar and another note, usually an open string, will ring and start playing by itself because it shares some of the frequencies with the note we're playing. So for example, here I'm playing an E on string 8, fret 10. When I play this note, string 6 starts to ring. This is because string 6 is also an E and shares the same frequency of vibration as the note I am playing. That vibration is enough to set it off and get it ringing. You'll also notice string 2 ringing a little bit, and that is because B is the second harmonic above an E, which means it's one of the notes that makes up the sound of our E note. As you can probably guess, these sympathetic vibrations cause a lot of issues when we're trying to play and when we're trying to play cleanly. This is also why you may have noticed I have little hair ties tied around the headstock of my guitar. The strings above the nut will also vibrate when they share a frequency with what I'm playing. And those vibrations on this guitar at least do come through on the pickups, so it just creates kind of this general noise while I'm playing. So what's the solution? Well, we have to figure out how to mute these extra strings. This can be done in a few different ways, one of which is to use your right hand and use the edge of your palm to cover the strings while you're playing. This can work, but I find sometimes, depending on the playing position and what I need to be doing, my hand is not big enough to cover every single string, and some will sneak through and ring out. So in combination with this, we can use our left hand. The left hand can do things like using the side of the finger that's playing a note to cover some extra strings, or using any available finger that is not playing to cover the strings. Usually a combination of those two hand techniques will get you covered and you won't get any sympathetic resonance. However, sometimes there is still one or two sneaky strings that you cannot cover this way. And in that case, I just use the fingers on my picking hand and actually touch the string that is ringing out. Some people recommend using fret wraps. Those are those padded wraps that go around the bottom of your neck to kind of cover the open strings to make sure that they don't ring when you're not playing them. I don't personally recommend that because there are not that many times where I'm playing and I just don't want an open string the entire time I'm playing. Like I usually want to play fretted notes and open strings at some point, and that fret wrap doesn't really allow you to do that. With such a huge frequency range available to us on the A string guitar, it can be a little bit challenging sometimes to dial in some amp tones that sound good. Also, it becomes more important to know how to use your pickups effectively. If you're playing in the high register, it might be more useful to play in the bridge pickup position to get warmer tones so that it's not too shrill. And if you're playing more chordal passages or rhythm guitar stuff, it might be more important now to switch to that bridge pickup to get clarity in those low frequencies. Alright, so I've got Neural DSP's archetype Pliny up here, and we're just going to do a quick tone dial in to show you what I mean about these things. So first, I think we've got to get the output and input going. So I'm starting with everything turned to 0, just so you can see I'm doing this from scratch, just starting at the default setting and then turned everything to 0. We're going to turn up the gain to turn up the input, and the output a little bit, and the master volume as well, so we're not getting anything. Just to get a volume. There we go. We have sound. Alright, and I'm also going to turn off any reverb and effects that might be going on right now. Alright, everything's off. So, we're just going to go for kind of a basic, distorted, rock, metal tone. Something simple to start here, so I have our volume. Let's bring up the bass. And I just want to show you what effect this has. So if we turn the bass all the way up, we can hear it turns to mud. Like it doesn't do much nice for those low strings. And I am on the treble, or the bridge pickup, so it's not like I'm on the neck pickup and it's making it worse. That's on the treble pickup. So we're going to bring the bass down a bit so we don't get too much mud. We're going to bring the mids up. We're not going to deal with them quite yet because I just want to get the treble up as well here. Okay, there's the distortion coming up with the mid and treble. So, mids are often the hardest thing to hear, so we're going to go to the extremes and see what happens. So we're going to turn this up here. And turn it back down. So it's a little like fatter without those mids, but you lose a little bit of clarity. Alright, so there it starts to thin out, in my opinion, on this particular amp, and with the other settings we have currently. So, that could be good if you're in a mix where you don't want so much low end, but if you're just playing by yourself and you want a nice fat bottom, and, you can turn the mids down a little bit. Let's deal with the treble a little bit more. So all the way up. Hear those high frequencies, those high harmonics coming out, all the way down. It's kind of like somebody just shaved off the top of the frequency spectrum. So nice. I think that's sounding pretty good there. Let's deal with the presence knob here. Presence is kind of like high end as well. It's just an upper end boost. So here, as soon as we turn that up past the halfway mark, the whole feeling of the guitar sound is brighter. If we go too high, it gets like too thin, in my opinion. A little bit too crisp. Without any presence, it kind of lacks any life. So there we go. I think that's okay for now. Let's deal with the gain now. So gain is, yes, the input volume, but it's also going to cause breakup and distortion by forcing more of the guitar sound through the circuitry of the amplifier. So that's sounding pretty sweet. Let's see what full gain sounds like. A little bit much. Sounds good. We can always add pedals and stuff if we need to after. Let's see what this bright switch does. My guess is it's going to engage a kind of low cut filter or high pass filter. See what it does to the high end. Yeah, I think it sounds pretty good. We can even back off the treble a little bit now that that's on. Nice. Great, and then, so that's a pretty good setting to get us going, and then we can always go into the pedals, add a little bit of reverb. It's a bit much to thicken up our sound a little bit. And then we can add a little bit of delay, especially if we're doing lead stuff. This is just a bridge pickup setting we're dialing in here. So if we were to switch to the middle pickup, it's pretty thick. Split coil. Sounds pretty good. So just by, there's so many parameters we can change to get a different sound, but I think the main focus of this is just how to dial in the amp settings to find something that sounds good to get you going. One of the most challenging things mentally and emotionally for me when switching to an 8-string guitar was that muscle memory just kind of fails. After spending almost 20 years learning the guitar, I kind of expected that some of that skill would transfer to the 8-string. However, when I picked up the guitar, it kind of just didn't work that way. All the licks, the scales, the interval shapes I knew, the chord shapes I knew, the songs I knew, they didn't come naturally. It didn't feel like just another 6-string guitar with a maybe 1 week break-in period. After a few months, I realized there'd be some extra work to have to relearn a lot of the things I've done before. And I don't want to downplay the mental and emotional toll that this can take on you. We spend so much time practicing, like hours and hours and hours on end for years to get good at this instrument, and then all of a sudden you switch, and it feels like all of that goes out the window. A lot of people at this point would probably just quit, hang up their 8-string, say it's a cool little thing if I want to play along with a metal song that needs an 8-string guitar, but I'm going to stick to 6-string. And I totally get that, but I do believe that the 8-string guitar has so much potential if people can stick with it and practice it. Treat it like a new instrument. Don't try to compare it to your 6-string guitar, but if you stick with it, I think there can be so many cool things that can be accomplished with it. There is no direct solution, unfortunately, to this one. It's going to be a bit of a bummer when you switch to an 8-string for a while, but if you stick with it, keep practicing, keep learning songs, try to stay excited by learning cool new songs you could never learn before, eventually, after some time passes, your hands will get used to it, you'll develop some new scales, some new chords, and you'll be able to play just as well, if not better, than you used to. A huge part of the guitar is playing chords. Chord shapes you know already on the 6-string though, will not transfer to the 8-string, at least for the most part. And this doesn't just mean trying to play an open E chord and it sounding like garbage. I also mean that if you take some shapes that you already know and just try to move them onto the lower strings, it won't work as well. For example, I'm just going to play a major triad, starting on some higher strings and moving it lower. By the time I get to the bottom, the sound is super muddy, super unclear what I'm playing, and it just wouldn't be used in any practical scenario. So why does this happen? Every note has frequencies that make up the note that we hear. The main note that we hear and identify when we're hearing a pitch is called the fundamental, and the other frequencies are called harmonics, sometimes called overtones. Together, they make up the sound we hear. There is a mathematical and predictable way to determine the harmonics or overtones of any note, and that is just to multiply what the frequency is. So for example, we have a low A here at 55 hertz. The other harmonics that are within this note include 2 times the frequency, so 110 hertz, which sounds like an octave above that. 3 times, which is going to be 165 hertz, or an octave and a fifth. We have 4 times, which is going to be 2 octaves higher. 5 times, which approximately is the major third above that. 6 times, and so on and so on. So all of these notes are included in the note that we're hearing when we just play. The thing is, they're not as loud. That's why we don't really hear them as readily. And the higher we go in those multiples, the quieter they get. So if we try to play a chord that's too low, each of the notes has its own fundamental pitch and all of the harmonics that make up each of those notes. Because there are now so many frequencies competing for vibrational space, it sounds muddy. The reason this isn't really an issue on 6-string guitar is because higher frequencies don't have to compete as much for space. Their waveform amplitude is a lot smaller, and their wavelength is a lot smaller. So they literally do not take up as much airspace when they are happening. So we can play things like this, which is a very dense clustered chord, and not have too much interruption between the notes. Whereas if we try to do something like that on the low strings, it just turns to mud. There is a theory called low interval limits that explains this. If we look at this image, we can see all the theorized low end limits of different intervals. Notice that none of them go below a B flat under the bass clef, other than the octave, which always will sound good no matter where you play it. The perfect fifth and the major 10th all kind of stop at this B flat, and on our 8-string guitar, that's going to be fret 4 on string 8. So if we play a perfect fifth above that, it still sounds fairly clear. If we start to move below, it's okay, but we can hear it starting to muddy up. Similarly, a major 10th sounds very nice. But as we go lower, again, it starts to muddy, but it still sounds okay. With the guitar, we can get away with a lot more things just because it's such a homogeneous sound. So we won't get into this mud territory as quickly as something like, say, a piano. This is a good general guide, though, to see what kind of chords we can play and how low we can get with them before they just turn into garbage. So when you're trying to develop some sort of chordal language using the low strings of the 8-string, you might have to develop some new strategies that don't include just transposing our chord shapes we already know on higher strings to those lower strings. I suggest trying to just add bass notes to some of the chords you already know, or create large intervallic chord structures using those low strings. So I hope this video was helpful if you've just got an 8-string guitar or you're looking to get one and you're wondering what some of the difficulties might be in that transition period. Like I said earlier, each of these ideas deserves its own video to go more in depth into the strategies we can apply to deal with them, but knowing about these issues that we all face is half the battle, and it can help illuminate what you might need to work on in your practice. If you'd like to work on any of these issues together, I offer online lessons, links down in the description. But with that said, that's it for me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and happy practicing.